students have a right to protest, has to be within the law. It's the same back home in the UK. I don't know whether this is indicative of a bigger trend. We support Israel's right to self-defense, and that's why we joined the action against Iran the other day.
I sat down with the outgoing UK ambassador to America, Dame Karen Pierce, for an update on the state of the special relationship. Dame Karen Pierce, welcome to Never Mind The Ballots.
Thank you.
You're coming to the end of your 4 years here in Washington. What a 4 years it's been. 2 presidents, 3 prime ministers. You might see a 4th before your term is finished. 2 massive global issues, a pandemic, a US election with one candidate on trial and the other candidate with their own flaws in different ways. Did you ever pinch yourself and think, what have I got myself into?
Never. It's a fantastic honour to be here on behalf of the British people and the government, and obviously ambassadors are the King's representative. I have to say I'm a real fan of American politics, and I think people forget that over the years American politics are quite turbulent.
Yeah.
But the important thing is that the relationship between the UK and America endures through all that turbulence, no matter how many prime ministers we may be having at the time.
And it's a special relationship, our favourite topic of discussion domestically whenever we talk about US. Is it in better nick than 4 years ago? How are you handing it over to your successor?
Well, I'm here till around the end of the year, so I've got a bit of time to go yet. But I hope I'm handing over a relationship that is as strong as it's ever been, and really making inroads into new areas. Everybody knows about the defence special relationship, the security, the intelligence, the bedrock on which the special relationship, Churchill's phrase, was built. What we're trying to do, particularly in the embassy, is, if you like, forge common frameworks with the Americans for the particular challenges of the 21st century, which, as you alluded to, are proving, quite unpredictable. But the one I'd highlight most, I think, is artificial intelligence.
All right.
We had the safety summit with the Vice President. We're setting up safety standards with the US. So I think that's a great example of how we're taking this already deep, profound and successful relationship and taking it into new areas.
Do you think that we get a little bit too obsessed with this idea of a special relationship? Every time a president comes to the US or the Prime Minister comes here, they have to sort of tick it off in a box. Do you not think it's more important than just sort of words? I mean, do we obsess about this too much?
I think there's a real thing there, as I was saying. It's forged in defence and security. Look at what we do together in the Red Sea. But it's also forged on common heritage and common values, and the late Queen used to allude to those when she saw presidents. But if you ask me honestly, yes, I think the media are a bit
I'm not sure it's the media. I think it's politicians.
Well, no, we just see it as our job, as all my colleagues do who are ambassadors around the world, to get on and to do the very best we can for Britain and the British people in the countries we're posted to. But of course, with America, that agenda is so broad and so deep, there's an enormous amount to do. And again, if you look at the Red Sea, you look at Ukraine, often when there are major challenges in the world, it's Britain and the US standing shoulder to shoulder. And even if other allies come on board, as they often do, again, Ukraine and the Red Sea, often the first movers are Britain and America.
Are you confident that would be maintained under a return to a Trump White House? Would it potentially happen next year?
Well, it did happen from 2016 on.
And there were quite a few flashpoints between the special relationship during those years.
There always are, though. This is what I think is often not appreciated. When I first arrived in America, in the embassy in the early 1990s, there was a war in Bosnia which caused a lot of disruption between the US and Europe. Britain and France had troops on the ground. There was the Northern Ireland issue, but eventually America played a crucial role in supporting the Good Friday Agreement. So there were huge disagreements, I remember, on things like air services. There always are disagreements. What's important is that they don't disrupt the fundamentals of the relationship.
What have been the hardest bits? Obviously, your predecessor left in a diplomatic row, I think we can call it, with the Trump White House. How much bridge building would there have to be after that? What was that when you first arrived? How did you sort of mend that schism?
Well, there's a lot of goodwill in both the Trump and the Biden administrations towards the UK and towards me personally. When I arrived, both camps, Democratic and Republican, were very kind, very open, very accessible. So I've tried to do my best to forge relationships on both sides.
There have been flashpoints though. There's been, the situation with Huawei. Obviously, America put a huge amount of pressure on Britain to strip out Huawei goods from our networks. How much pressure was put on the British government by the Americans to raise defence spending? The announcement we've seen in recent days.
No pressure was put. This is the Prime Minister's and the government's decision.
Really?
It's been warmly welcomed here. Well, I think you've heard Americans, and not just President Trump, a wide range of Americans in Congress, commentators, call for Europe to do more on defence spending in general. And NATO set a 2% ceiling, and you heard the Prime Minister the other day say he thinks this should increase to 2.5%, given all the challenges, the geopolitical challenges that we're facing in the world, and that's what we're doing. The announcement has been really positively received here. And on Ukraine, people are starting to appreciate what the Europeans are doing. I think the UK was always known to be a very strong supporter of Ukraine here, given the amount of material we've provided, the troops we've trained, but figures that the Europeans are doing their bit are getting to be heard.
How much of a role do you think Lord Cameron, new Foreign Secretary, had in shifting the mood when he went to see Trump? Oh, you went to see Trump. How was he?
It's always good to see presidents.
Candidates.
But we're not going to talk about the substance of the conversation. But yes, the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron,
did you think it had an impact on the result we saw last week?
I think all these things contribute to the eventual passing of the supplemental, but I would pay tribute to the House and Senate leadership on both sides of the aisle. It was a very good move for bipartisanship.
It does seem that Trump's slightly sitting this one out. He hasn't, whereas lots of his supporters have criticised Speaker Johnson for pushing the vote, he seems mute on this. It sounds to me he was on board with it.
Well, I think President Trump came out with support for Speaker Johnson, but obviously you'd have to ask him about his views. But very good news for Ukraine, a supplemental has passed, and that the administration very quickly got on the front foot in getting the material out to Ukraine so it can make a difference on the ground.
You've dealt with two different White Houses. What were the biggest difference between the administrations you've dealt with? Who was harder to deal with? Who was easier? What's the fundamentals there?
I've actually dealt with four different White Houses, because in my previous tour here, it was the end of George H.W. Bush and the beginning of Bill Clinton. I would say, and this is very generalized, with Republican administrations, a lot of it depends on personal relationships and getting to the right person, and with Democratic administrations, a lot of it depends on the route you take, the procedures you use, the process you use. And then, of course, you have to remember Congress is an integral part of the US government. So the embassy spends a lot of its time, I spend a lot of my time on the Hill talking to members of Congress on both sides.
Do you think the world is, we're sort of waiting, holding its breath somewhat for a return of Donald Trump. Do you think America is ready for the return of Donald Trump? Or?
Oh, that's up to America. My job is Americans. My job is to work with whoever Americans elect as the next president, Democrat or Republican. It's been my job in these 4 years to make sure we have the relationships on both sides.
On a broader theme then, you've had a front row seat in a big chunk of American history really now. Is America in better nick than when you first came here? It feels to me like it's a much more divided country.
I think all countries have their challenges, particularly given the unpredictable nature and the return to geopolitics. But I would agree with those Americans who think of America as the indispensable nation. American leadership in the world has, on the whole, it's always an on the whole argument, kept us safe and prosperous since the end of the Second World War. And Britain is immeasurably served by American leadership. So that's one of the things we talk about here, and we encourage America to keep playing that role. Our job as Brits, as you saw with the Prime Minister's defence announcement, it's to burden share, it's to help problem solve, it's to put our shoulders to the wheel.
But you look at the situation, look at what's just happening this week on American campuses, scenes that we haven't really seen since the sort of 1960s in some levels. Are you worried about the direction that Britain's going in? What are you telling, what advice are you giving the government back home about the situation in America right today?
Well, the campuses obviously reflect the very strong views about what's going on in Israel, Gaza. There's no place for anti-Semitism on campus. The administration, congressional figures have been very clear about that. The British government's been clear about that. Students have a right to protest, has to be within the law. It's the same back home in the UK. I don't know whether this is indicative of a bigger trend. I think some commentators have said that the Israel-Gaza is, if you like, the cause of this generation. What we need to do now is ensure the hostages get out, get more aid in, get all the crossing points open so that more aid can get in, encourage the Israelis, urge the Israelis to take more care over civilian casualties. Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have been very strong on that, but fundamentally we support Israel's right to self-defense, and that's why we joined the action against Iran the other day.
We always look at through the British lens of America and its upheaval and its craziness and politics, as we've discussed. But we've had a pretty turbulent time back at home during the time that you've been ambassador. There's been 3 different prime ministers. How's Britain viewed in America? Because it must look like we've lost our marbles sometimes, right?
I don't think we're viewed like that. Britain is still seen as the closest ally, the only really global ally with reach across the world, and an ally who can be relied on to share America's values. What is interesting, though, I will admit that some politicians had a wry smile when our politics briefly became almost as turbulent as theirs.
Well, it also became it briefly became an American talking point during the midterms when President Biden made that extraordinary intervention after the Liz Truss's mini budget to openly criticise domestic politics. That must have been a tricky day at the office.
No, that was, I think this is part of the wear and tear of politics.
So you think that was acceptable for him to intervene on that?
I didn't say it was sensible, and I didn't say I agreed with it, but I think this is what politicians do, and it's a sign of how much interest, if you like, the public and politicians take in each other's country, that people feel they can make those comments. Of course, not for me to comment on what the president said. My job to defend what the Britain Prime Minister is doing.
Obviously, the other great issue, geopolitical, foreign policy issue that no one really likes to talk about anymore, Brexit. Has that made...
Oh, gosh.
Yes, exactly. That's my...
That's
remember
a long
that.
time ago,
well,
Harry, and it's over.
Did it make... Is it over, or is it a sort of ongoing thing? One of the big things that the Brexiteers sold the voting public was the idea of getting a simple US trade deal, but it's obviously talks are on ice. It's not happening really, is it? What's happening there, and has Brexit made your job harder or easier?
Brexit had already happened by the time I
know, but
came here.
the lasting impact of it is going to...
in trade terms, you have to remember that trade and investment is just growing between Britain and America. Something like $1 trillion flows backwards and forwards across the Atlantic between the two countries every year in trade and investment, and the trade is around $300 million, which is a huge $300 billion, I beg your pardon, huge figure. We've also started to work with individual states in America to see where we can enhance export promotion and more cooperation, whether that's on clean energy or it's on tech.
But a free trade deal with the United States still, to me, seems, years away, whoever's in power.
I don't know if it's years away, but it's not a thing of the moment, and that at the moment is something both governments are comfortable with. After the elections in both the UK and the US, let's see. I think what is important is that the UK joined the Pacific, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that will be an incredibly important geopolitical thing, but it will also give us many trading opportunities.
We're coming to the end of our time. What's been your finest moment here?
Oh, I don't know that that's for me to say.
Oh,
I'd rather other people
Okay, well then, what's been your worst moment?
I'm certainly not doing that one. But I would point to maybe a few things. The reaction to the Queen's death was incredibly moving.
Yeah.
We had Americans spontaneously queuing
Book
at
of
the
condolence
embassy.
here, was it?
It was wall-to-wall coverage. The President was the first world leader to come and sign the condolence book. He came here. We had 2 hours to get ready, had to find a red carpet, had to polish
is there one back here?
all the glass. There is
in
actually,
the cupboard,
there
yeah.
is actually. He was incredibly generous in his remarks, as was the First Lady. And then we had a very moving memorial service for the Queen at the Cathedral. I think the other thing I'd pick would be going to Pearl Harbor for the 80th commemoration of Pearl Harbor. And you go out on a launch and scatter petals above the Arizona, which is the ship that sank with many hands on board. Those two things seem to me very poignant. But the other thing was on the coronation, and I'm pointing to outside the embassy, which the viewers won't be able to see. We had 6,000 people queuing up to whom we served tea and shortbread.
Fantastic.
As a celebration of Britain.
That's soft power.
So
soft power right there,
that was
isn't it?
pretty good.
And look, 4 years in America is an amazing innings by anyone's standards. There's rumours that you're not done yet, though, and perhaps we might be seeing you more on a domestic scene back in Whitehall. Perhaps is there another big job in you?
I love the public sector.
Yeah.
I like working in the public sector, but at the moment I'm thoroughly concentrating on doing the best possible job I can here. It's a fantastic job. I'm incredibly lucky to have it. I value the trust the government placed in me in being here, and it's my job to leave this relationship in the strongest possible position.
It's not a denial that you fancy one more big gig, cabinet secretary maybe.
My job's here.
Dame Karen Pearce, thank you for joining Never Mind the Ballots. Thank you.